Hello and welcome to the Feckit Fun, Fabulous and Free Eating Disorder Recovery podcast. I'm Helly and I'm here to provide regular bursts of information and inspiration, some neuroscience applicable to eating disorder recovery, perhaps a few rants, but otherwise lots of positivity with a bit of a Feckit attitude, some fun and a sprinkling of fabulousness to help everyone find freedom in recovery. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Feckit Fun, Fabulous and Free Eating Disorder Recovery podcast. I'm Helly and today's episode is on the topic of fear, but speaking about fear from a different perspective to the one we usually speak about when it comes to eating disorders and recovery from an eating disorder. Because we often do speak about fear when it comes to eating disorders and recovery, and that's for a very good reason. Of course, in eating disorder recovery, it means that you have to repeatedly take action that creates an incredibly powerful fear response within you in order to teach your brain that the fear to food, the fear to resting, the fear to weight gain, and other fears are not grounded, so that with continued exposure and repetition of all these things in recovery, your brain rewires and understands that these fears aren't grounded, enabling you to eat all you want, rest whenever you like, and accept your natural body weight, all without even a quiver of uncertainty or anxiety, let alone the full-blown panic that you might have at the moment, and being able to do all those things with none of that in your future life. But the angle in eating disorder recovery that we often don't talk about when it comes to fear is about how, as with all things in life, fear can be not just a deterrent from things, but also a really powerful motivator that can spur you into action if you let it. So if you think about this from a non-eating disordered example, and you've probably experienced this in other areas of your life anyway. So let's think about a student who's not studied all year and then suddenly realises that they have their final exams next week. They are going to be pretty darned terrified that they're going to be failing those exams and they are going to have wasted the entire year, and they're going to have quite a strong fear about the fact that they might fail those exams. And that level of fear might then be a powerful motivator to then spur them into taking on some serious revising over the next few days before their exams, and so that they can really try and get in some serious studying in that time, in the hope it will be enough to get them through the exams, and with the hope that they haven't allowed the whole year to go to waste. And in a similar way, you can use fear in relation to eating disorders to really spur you into recovery action. Because the fear of not recovering should be terrifying, because it is a terrifying thought, a terrifying prospect. The thought of living with an eating disorder for the rest of your life should scare you, because it's not a happy prospect for anyone. And that fear of not recovering is one that you can really use as a powerful motivator for your recovery. And I know for me, in my case, the fear of not recovering became the ultimate motivator really to force me into the recovery action that I did then take and push me to start the recovery process that then did ultimately get me to where I needed to be. Because for me, I was deeply entrenched in the eating disorder, and I had been for several years, many years. And I had had half-hearted attempts at recovery up until then, but nothing really serious or meaningful enough. And as I approached the age of 40 and my 40th birthday came around, it really hit me that I could live with this eating disorder for the rest of my life. And that was a terrifying thought. I couldn't envision having to live another however many years I had left of my life, which could have been another 30, 40, 50 years. I couldn't fathom or accept living out my days with an eating disorder and living that misery and that isolated world and that cold, routine-driven, rigid and really miserable existence that is life with an eating disorder. To even contemplate living like that for the rest of my life really, really scared me. And it was that fear that was a large part of what spurred me into doing everything that I, on a lot of levels, didn't want to do, but still spurred me into doing everything, whether I wanted to do it or not, and find ways to push into all the things recovery takes in order to push forwards and into a life on the other side, and find out just what was possible for me in my future, potentially without that eating disorder. And just now as well, just to bring it back to a more neuroscience-y level too, because you know if you listen to this podcast regularly that I love a bit of neuroscience and love to bring in a bit of evidence about how the brain is working and why some of these tools we can use in recovery are actually really key on a brain-based level as well. And the use of fear as a motivator is also known to help ensure that the brain is primed for neuroplasticity. And of course, neuroplasticity is the technical word for rewiring the brain, which we talk about in recovery. And if you do want to know more about what neuroplasticity is and rewiring in recovery, then do have a listen to some of my earlier podcast episodes on that topic, where I talk a lot more about exactly what it is and why it matters in recovery. But for this episode, I just wanted to highlight the fact that neuroscientist researchers have now discovered that fear, as a motivator, prepares the brain and really primes the brain ready for neuroplasticity and so ultimately for rewiring. So in recovery, if you can use fear as a motivator by focusing in on what not recovering from this eating disorder will really mean for you and for your future, and really make it personal and meaningful for you. Bring in what impact not recovering could have on your relationships, on your family, on your work life or your studies, on your physical and longer term mental health as well. And I think anyone who's had an eating disorder for any length of time can say hand on heart that life gets smaller and smaller and more miserable with each passing year in the illness. And I know it's a horrible thought to have to think about what your life could be if you don't recover. But if you can really focus in on that and bring up that fear as to why you are going through this tough process, it will really alert your brain to the importance of the recovery changes you're making. Bring in that fear of not recovering. Bring in that fear of not taking this recovery action so that your brain will really, really understand why you're making these changes, why you're pushing yourself to go through these really fear-inducing actions. And as your brain really starts to grasp and understand that, it will make more and more intense connections between your brain cells, more likely to develop and strengthen in the rewiring process, which is ultimately what you want. So then if you are in eating disorder recovery at the moment, don't just focus on overcoming the fear that arises when you are making changes in your recovery. Although that is also, of course, very important. And you do need to understand and have fear management steps and measures to use so that you can put in the recovery action. But also, as I'm highlighting for this episode, keep a hold of that fear of staying sick as a motivator to push through all the hard and intensive work of recovery, so that when you're struggling, you can tap into that fear as a motivator. Tap into that fear of what your life could look like if you don't recover. Because that fear should be pretty darn terrifying. That fear should be more terrifying than any of the fear created by the eating disorder. Because not recovering is terrifying, absolutely terrifying as a prospect. And holding on to that fear of not recovering and what that would mean for you will also help make the fear of facing recovery situations less intensive, as your brain will also begin to understand why facing those recovery fears around food or resting are actually so important to you. So that's the episode for today. A shorter one, but hopefully something for you to have a think about and how to apply it in your recovery process. In the meantime, keep eating, keep resting, keep aiming for the stars every moment of every day with your recovery action, and you will get there. I'm Helly, and I will speak to you again in the next episode. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to the Feckit Fun, Fabulous and Free Eating Disorder Recovery podcast. Don't forget, eating disorder recovery doesn't have to be boring and doesn't have to be serious. Now go and grab yourself some food and have a fabulous rest of the day.